Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. A new deal, a ray of hope for Syria? And is Russia really trying to manipulate American elections? Also, Ukraine's dark present and future. Finally, the optics of G20. Two Crosstalk stories in the media. I'm joined by my guest in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Sputnik International. We also have Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus, if I can go to you first in London, we have a new ceasefire agreement. At least it's planned for a week, and then steps later can be taken. But how different is this from February, and why all the secrecy around it? Go ahead.
Well, I think we have to approach the current ceasefire with great caution and also great scepticism, because there have been numerous other ceasefires over the duration of the conflict in Syria, and they have all failed. Also, the details about the current ceasefire are very sketchy. However, what we do know is that there is an agreement that the Russian and American air forces, which are the two most powerful air forces in the world, will not only coordinate their actions against ISIS, but also against al-Nusra. Now, America attacking al-Nusra would be a new thing. That would be a development. And I would welcome that. I welcome any country in the world that is prepared to fight ISIS and al-Nusra. However, here are three problems. Number one, not all the various Islamist terrorist groups in Syria are prepared to stop fighting alongside al-Nusra. There's this myth propagated by the West that al-Nusra and ISIS, they fight separately in Syria. Well, no, they don't. All the different terrorist groups, they fight together. And in fact, al-Nusra militarily is stronger than the FSA. So the FSA does not want to end its relationship with al-Nusra.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Mark, let me go to you, because we had Secretary Kerry say Washington is going the extra mile. Also, he hopes that Russia has the capacity to press the Assad regime to stop this conflict and to come to the table to make peace. After 5 years, the same rhetoric coming out of Washington.
Yeah, and the United States has not changed their position that this political process that they believe they're beginning is to end in regime change in Syria. And of course, the Russian government disagrees. So that alone does not bode well.
But what we heard also, working towards a political transition. Let me go to Dima here. I mean, again, what does that mean? Because a lot of different players have a lot of different interpretations of what that phrase means. And it doesn't come out of Damascus. Go ahead.
Well, the so-called moderate opposition already has a roadmap, you know, how Mr. Assad is going to be removed, how the transitional government is going to be installed. Meanwhile, you know, the Syrian government forces is so far the only force that is keeping the rebels, the Islamist rebels, from taking Damascus and getting control of the country. Even the Washington Post agrees that al-Nusra, alongside other Islamist and nationalist brigade, is the most capable fighting force in Idlib, in that coalition. So it's
not just
strange.
in Idlib, in the entire country. We've got, you don't have to believe, you know, us. Take a look at the West's top experts in the field. Faisal Latani at the Atlantic Council, Sam Heller at the Century Foundation, the acknowledged experts on Syria and the forces on the ground. They say that the al-Nusra, Jabhat now Fatah al-Sham, the army for the conquest of Syria, is the dominant umbrella under which all of the rebels fight. And that if they were folded up, if they were forced to separate, that the insurgency, the U.S.-backed militias, would immediately collapse because there's nothing else there.
Let me go back
and they defend that as a reason not to attack al-Qaeda.
Let me go back to Marcus in London. One of the interesting, I want to go back to the secrecy issue, because I think it's very interesting here. It took 9 hours for the Americans to finally agree, and I have the sense that it was Lavrov that was driving this. All these negotiations have been driven by the Russians, not by the Americans. And they've pushed the Europeans out from the American side here. It seems to me that some kind of concession was made. That's why they're keeping it a secret, because if you have the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians all in agreement with this ceasefire, so-called, and the Americans don't want the details to be known, do you think that it's possible that the Americans made some kind of temporary concession at least?
Yes, I do believe that. I think on the one hand, you have unity amongst the Syrian government, the Russian government and the Iranian government. But on the other hand, there's a great deal of disunity between the Americans, the Turks, the Saudis and the Qataris. And I believe that Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey will have been very, very apprehensive about any agreement in which the American Air Force will start attacking al-Nusra, because as I said earlier, and as the other two guests have also pointed out, after ISIS, al-Nusra is probably the most formidable Islamist terrorist group in Syria, and that is a threat to the Syrian army. If the American Air Force starts bombing al-Nusra, who will benefit? Ultimately, the Syrian army will benefit, which is a good thing. However, America's allies in the region will not be so happy about that. We also need to take into consideration another little factor, perhaps not such a little factor. There is a Turkish military presence in the north of Syria now. The Turks do not look like they're going to be withdrawing anytime soon from northern Syria. And if the Syrian army is to continue advancing, and if we can say this truce fails, which unfortunately I believe it will fail, then sooner or later the Syrian army is going to come up against the Turkish incursion force in northern Syria. Then what?
That's what we're all going to be looking. That's all what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to have to switch gears. We've got a lot to talk about today, gentlemen. Mark, let me go to you. We still have this assumed, alleged role of Russia playing politics in American elections here. One of the things I find interesting, has it benefited the Clinton campaign, do you think, or is it just something on the periphery?
Well, certainly it's benefited the Clinton campaign. From the very beginning, the accusations of it were used to distract the public's attention away from the exposure that the primary process within the Democratic Party was essentially rigged in Clinton's favor. So this scary man, this bogeyman created to provide a distraction from that and say, oh, Russia's responsible, never mind the details of what allegedly Russia revealed. But again and again, there's a lot of headlines, there's a lot of hysteria coming out of the Washington Post, the New York Times, elsewhere from the Clinton campaign itself. But if you read into the articles, 2 or 3 paragraphs down, you'll always find the U.S. intelligence officials forced to admit, we have no evidence of any of this. We're conducting an investigation, but we have no evidence.
You know, Dima, finally President Putin came out and said that Russia is not interested in this type of intervention.
We don't do it on the state level.
We don't do it on the state level here. How do you think the Kremlin is reacting to all of this?
Well, I mean, how can Kremlin be reacting when you have such hostile rhetoric around it? I mean, let me quote Mrs. Clinton. A foreign adversarial power is behind Donald Trump. I don't remember during the U.S. elections anyone using this kind of language about another country with which you are not at war. Then the character assassination of Trump. I'm sorry, I have a mailing system. I get messages from the Washington Post and from the New York Times. 95% of the articles are about how bad Trump is, how he's dangerous for the country. Then we have no one but Michael Morrell, the former acting CIA director, who says that this is the first time I can remember a candidate for president, Trump, doing a readout from an intelligence briefing. Trump met some intelligence officers.
Based on what evidence? Does he cite any evidence?
Well, the whole problem is that...
We have to remind our viewers, he's the same person that talked to Charlie Rose and said, start killing Russians and Iranians here.
Isn't it the first time that we hear a former CIA director saying things like that?
He openly said to assassinate Russians and Iranians to make them pay the price.
And he's concerned about Trump saying something about
I wish he'd be more concerned about ethics and international law. Marcus, one of the things that I find very interesting in looking at this charade that's being played out, I mean, a new form of McCarthyism here, is that the United States has a very, very long, and I would even say very bloody history of intervention in other people's internal affairs and their electoral process here. I mean, is the United States so vulnerable to the outside world that outside powers are going to manipulate its elections? I mean, this is like looking for the boogeyman under your bed. This is really quite absurd. Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, it must be one of the ironies of the 21st century for America to accuse Russia, or indeed any other country in the world, of interfering in the affairs of domestic countries. I mean, it's absolutely preposterous nonsense. Look, you know, of course the Kremlin will be watching very closely what's happening in the American presidential election. And of course the Kremlin will be making plans in the event of a Clinton presidency or in the event of a Trump presidency. And of course some within the Kremlin will privately prefer a Clinton presidency, will prefer a Trump presidency. If you go back to the 1980 American presidential election between Reagan and Carter, some people within the Soviet military establishment wanted Reagan to win. Why? Because that would have meant more an increase in the defense budget for the Soviet armed forces. So it's only natural that Russia is watching carefully and is making plans. But in terms of Russia interfering in the American presidential election, well, of course, that is a complete and utter lie, and it's a manipulative lie. And it's not surprising that the Americans are using the Russian card, because of course since 1945 Russia, Soviet Union has featured prominently in American presidential elections.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on stories in the media. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some of the stories that have made a difference in the media. Okay, gentlemen, let's switch gears and let's talk about what's going on in Ukraine. We haven't talked about Ukraine on this program for a while here. Mark, if I can go to you first here. We have continued instability in the country. The political elite is divided. The IMF is sick and tired. I think they're holding back on the latest tranche because there's no reform going on in the country. There's no will to do it. And the Minsk Accords still remain outstanding here. There's no progress here.
No progress.
And Russia has made it very clear that, you know, to the West, you broke it, now you fix it, because Russia is not obligated to do that. Where does Ukraine stand right now?
Yeah, it's in a really dire situation. The situation continues to deteriorate both politically and economically, and to some extent military, where shelling continues in the Donbass with no end in sight. And it's possible we could be reaching a crux situation. This was exemplified over recent days when the number one television channel in the country, Inter, was firebombed by crowds of protesting ultranationalists. These are the same people who fought on the Maidan, who have been persecuting the war with atrocities in the Donbass. And they attacked the number one television and station in the country for supposed pro-Russian bias, which is completely untrue.
I'll tell you what it is.
Go ahead. Apparently, they caved too under this kind of pressure.
It's unimaginable. You know, they set it on fire. Let's call a spade a spade. They set that television station on fire because a few days before that station broadcast a concert, and in the end, one of the Ukrainian singers said this, you know, Nazi slogan: "Glory to Ukraine, to heroes' glory." That is the slogan of Bandera's nationalist organization UPA. And until 1942, it was followed by a Nazi salute. So because Inter didn't broadcast the moment when that singer said it, they said it was a pro-Russian channel. They came, they set it on fire, and what was especially astounding for me was the discussions on the matter next day on television, on ICTV. They said that government officials, experts, they all said that the government reacted too late. It should have silenced that television channel before. It should have cracked down on it before, so that too emotional civil activists would not have to get involved. That was the whole story about Inter.
This was done under deliberate incitement from the government. The Interior Minister Avakov
called it, an
he,
anti-Ukrainian
beforehand,
channel.
he called it an anti-Ukrainian, anti-state channel. He encouraged it, and afterwards he tried to suggest, like they did with the Odessa massacre, that the pro-Russians firebombed themselves.
Or they provoked it.
Marcus, let me go back to you in London. I mean, the Ukrainians like to call what happened on the Maidan a revolution of dignity. Where's the dignity of crushing freedom of speech, and where are the Western governments denouncing this type of behavior? Because I find it really obvious that because there's a political crisis and there's economic decline, everybody plays culture politics, and it usually plays the Russian language card or Russian culture card, and this is what's mobilizing the most unsavory elements of Ukrainian politics right now. Go ahead, Marcus in London.
Well, Peter, my answer to that would be, since when has America and its other Western allies in the world been genuinely committed to democracy, to freedom, to the rule of law? If America was genuinely committed to those things, then it wouldn't have such a close relationship with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, as we all know, is without a doubt the most vile, oppressive country in the world. And what we've seen since February 2014 in Ukraine is the country turn into a hideous country where the two dominant forces are ultranationalism and fascism. The rule of law is no longer existent, and we must never forget that ordinary people in Ukraine, from the north to the south, from the west to the east, are suffering. They are suffering because of the economic state of that country, which has been caused by that American-backed coup against a democratically elected leader in February 2014. And in regard to the Minsk Accords, the Ukrainian government is in breach of them. It has not withdrawn its heavy artillery, it has not afforded a special status to the Donbass, and also it will not give political immunity to candidates from the Donbass standing in elections. So contrary to what the West says, Russia is not in breach of the Minsk II peace accords. It is the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian government solely.
Marcus forgot to mention the main breach of the Minsk agreement. There is a food blockade against the east of Ukraine. No food can reach East Ukraine from Kiev and from other Ukrainian regions. There is also a money blockade. There is no Ukrainian bank activity in that area. So when the United States...
war crimes.
Exactly. And when the United States government insists that the border between these regions and Russia should be controlled by the Ukrainian border guards, what does it mean? They want to starve this territory into submission, because the only food that they get, the only money that they get, is through the Russian border.
You know, Mark, do you see that the current government there is it under threat of another political transition, a forced one, but from the right?
Is under threat from it, but I don't believe that the ultra-right has the power to overthrow this government, simply because they wouldn't have the backing on their own from the West, like the original Maidan would. So they can create problems. They can destabilize the country further. But I don't think there's any threat of them actually taking control.
It's one of the interesting things, because I think these political machinations are done on purpose and by the government, because the economy, I mean, it's a switch and bait thing.
You are right, but I agree with Mark that the ultra-right may not come to power in the near future. Why? Because Poroshenko, unlike Yanukovych, has the license to kill. If there is a demonstration against him in the center of Kiev and he just kills them all, the U.S. government will say he killed the fascists.
It has to be said, they are in power. They're just not in complete power. The Speaker of the Parliament, the Interior Minister, many other officials are themselves of the ultra-right. But the pro-Western neoliberals are still at some of the top positions, like the president and the prime ministership. And it's this unholy alliance and the uncomfortable nature of it that defines the very unpopular Ukrainian government.
Okay, gentlemen, we have to go to our last topic here. I want to talk about the optics of the G20 that just ended in China. For all the talk in Western media, I'm going to Dima here first, about Russia's isolation, well, guess what? Who was the most popular guy?
And who was declared by the host the guest of honor?
Go ahead.
It was Vladimir Putin.
But let's talk about the optics of that there. I mean, you know, Putin was the guest of honor. We had some scuffle. Obama had some scuffles, at least verbal scuffle, verbiage coming out from other leaders and whatnot. But everybody wanted a meeting with Putin.
Well, the whole problem is that you had two sorts sorts of rhetoric at this G20 meeting. There was the rhetoric from Russia and China, which was about, open up the economies, promoting global economy, promoting cooperation. And then you had the rhetoric from the United States and from the European Union. Jean-Claude Juncker from the European Commission said that China must change its metal exports or something. The United States said that China must, respect the territorial integrity of Philippines, get out of the South China Sea. Basically, that was their message. So you have two kinds of narratives, and they were in conflict in Hangzhou.
Meanwhile, the new president of the Philippines at the G20 called Obama a son of a whore.
Well, he apologized later on, but
okay, let's stay with the optics of it here, Marcos. I'm really glad that Dima Babic brought up these two different narratives, because I think that's really spot on. Because if you look at it from the G20 Summit, looking outside, you see a lot of paradigm shifts, as I would call it. Where if you look at Western media, it's the U.S. and its allies calling all the shots all around the world. But if you get into the trench, you see a very different world, and you see an emerging world that is challenging and actually, in many ways, ignoring some of the tenets that the West is demanding of the emerging world. Go ahead, Marcos, because I thought the optics were fascinating.
Yes, and we see a world in which Russia has a lot of allies, certainly more allies than what the West says. And that can only mean a good thing for the world in the future, a better world in terms of peace, a better world in terms of stability. However, I wouldn't read too much into what happened at the G20 summit in regard to Obama. Certainly, the West's hope that Putin would be isolated at G20 proved to be absolute nonsense. However, to be fair, Obama is coming to the end of his presidency, so his wings are clipped, so to speak. However, no one should read into that G20 summit and say that American power is declining. While I believe that American power has weakened, and has weakened largely because of the return of Russia to the international stage, American power today, American power in the foreseeable future will remain formidable. I can only refer to what happened in Kiev, Ukraine in February 2014. In Russia's backyard, in the birthplace of Russia, there was an American-backed coup. And today, Ukraine is striving towards EU membership, towards NATO membership. It probably won't get there, but the fact the Americans were able to carry out a coup in Kiev, Ukraine, of all places, demonstrates that American power is formidable. And anyone who says that it's a power on the way out, I'm afraid to say they are somewhat naive, and their talk is foolhardy.
Marcus disagreeing. I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah,
Mark, go ahead.
I agree with part of that, but at the same time, you can be strong in one area and weak in another. And Obama is a lame duck. The G20 proved that the U.S.'s Asian pivot, the attempt to contain China, to isolate Russia, has completely failed. He was embarrassed at the summit. He was humiliated. He was left out of discussions. A G20 is a talking shop. The majority of the real actions happens in bilateral political side meetings. Obama had about 2 of those. Putin had about 12 with all of the other major leaders of the G12. Obama was insulted. He had kerfuffles on just landing and getting off the plane, where he was forced to walk off an emergency exit because of disagreements, arguments with his people had with Chinese security people. It was a disaster politically, optics for Obama. And it is a sign that Obama is not the hegemon that it would like to be in every time and place. And personally, it is Obama's failure.
All right, on that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time. We never have enough time. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and London, and thanks to all our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love you.